Welcome to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun this week. I'm Matthew Brown, and I'm your host here at Maston 365. Here with you every Wednesday. Please hit subscribe to Spotify with Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, as well as hitting subscribe on YouTube. Leave reviews if you like, particularly if you love them. And yeah, again, thanks for having us. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the coronavirus and COVID. And really the failure of response, specifically by the GOP and GOP leadership, and really putting it on Trump. And I'm not saying these things lightly, and I know particularly it can be very difficult to prove in a world court for this. But I think it's time we start talking about these actions, and they're very intentional actions of not just downplaying the coronavirus threat, but in aiding in its spread and impact of health and death. It's hard to describe as anything but intentional, right? And because of that, because it's not just ignorance and being bad at a job, the intentionality of it pushes this into genocide. Genocide of not just, targeting Democrats or black and brown people, really black and brown people and lower income people really are impacted the most of this by this, right? But of really just Americans in general, this is neglect, this is homicide, this is, down the line, this is genocide. 200,000 Americans have died so far of this. 200,000, right? We had a little over 200,000 die in the entirety of combat deaths in World War II of Americans, right? A little over 55,000 died in Vietnam, right? We haven't even had, really reached even the Vietnam heights of deaths during this illegal long war on terror, right? And this is even beyond what we could describe of genocide on the Trump administration's behalf or actions when it has come to immigration policy, right? The intentional displacement and removing of families and of children and placing them into other people's care. Well, that falls within the definition of genocide as well. So there's really the elements of the crime, right? Can take place in the context of an armed conflict, international or non-international, or in the context of a peaceful situation. We could stretch and argue that we're in a so-called peaceful situation since we aren't at war. Granted, there are a lot of aspects, unpeaceful aspects going on right now within the United States, particularly when it has come to the rise of extremist white supremacists and extreme white nationalists enacting out their violence, a lot of times, and it seems currently on behalf of the state or the presidency in support of that. And we do see coordination, particularly among local police forces, with these white nationalist groups, as we've seen in Kenosha, right? But this is really, it's hard. So we have to really kind of, again, looking at UN definitions here, in them stating that the popular understanding of what constitutes genocide tends to be broader than international law. So there are certain elements to it when it comes to international law that has a narrower definition. And we might not quite, we might be getting on that border of meeting the international law, but I think in a more common understanding, we're absolutely within genocide. So for international law, there is a mental element, really the intent to destroy in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and a physical element, which includes the following 5 acts, it can be, basically they say that it doesn't have to include all of the following, but really, really parts, or kind of, really parts of the following. So this is kind of, it has to include A, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, right? So this intent, particularly the states within the UN, is most difficult element to determine, really to constitute genocide, right? So we have to prove intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Again, it doesn't have to be wholly, it can be in part, really within this, and it can't be simply to disperse. And so this is the tough part of it. So let's think through this. Let's think through the timeline before we even get to the Woodward tapes on this. So actually, let's jump to that with the Woodward tapes. Within these recorded attempts, it is shown that Trump has known since at least February 7th or early February, really, of the severity of this pandemic, of that it was more dangerous than the seasonal flu, that a lot of people were potentially going to die, that this was going to impact the economy, that is highly infectious down the line. He knew. Let's establish that he knew and underplayed it, right? So a bit of the timeline, January 22nd, at Davos, Trump makes the first public comment on the coronavirus, downplaying the risks. So we can really assume at this point that he's starting to understand the risks, because he had to have learned at some point before that first interview with Woodward, right? So he comments on the risks, downplays it, says we have it totally under control, says it's one person coming from from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine, right? January 24th, Trump praises China's efforts and transparency, thanks to the Chinese president for the response to the virus. Really, again, Trump in January 29th receives a briefing on the coronavirus and asserts the U.S. is on top of it 24/7. It's under control. January 21st, partial ban of travel from China, but not from other countries where at this point China was starting to have it much more under control. And you saw a spike, particularly in Europe and Brazil and other countries where the U.S. did not institute a travel ban, where it's far more dangerous. So again, this plays on xenophobia and racism within Trump. February 7th, though, Trump again tweets praising China's response. February 15th, first confirmed COVID death in Europe. February 23rd, Trump says it's under control. February 28th, it's a Dem hoax. March 6th, Trump lies in saying anyone can get a test, can get it. That is not true, and it's still partially not true depending on where you are in the United States. It took until May for a lot of states to have mass testing. And again, on May 9th, compared it to the common flu, March 9th, common flu, Trump declares a national emergency on March 13th. March 19th, Trump starts calling it the China virus again after weeks of praising the Chinese response. And then he switched to trying to blame it on China, trying to blame it on Democrats, really down the line. I'm going to stop the timeline there a little bit and run through kind of what we've seen since, where testing is still underfunded. In Wisconsin, it's still hard for the state to support this. There's no real federal funding for tests. When other countries have heavily invested in funding for tests, we're making it free, easy to access. When it comes to treatment, isn't necessarily free or easy to access still. Tracing is still almost non-existent, which means that, these are two of the key components when it comes to the so-called safe opening, right? Testing, tracing, and then there's other components such as having other countries have quarantine facilities really set up. Because of how this spreads, it's really the easiest spread are those that you are within close contact with, right? And that's particularly going to be family members, so on and so forth. So a lot of other countries, what they have within contact and tracing is that they then find and quarantine people they quarantine the infected person in a separate entity area other than with their family. People have had to self-quarantine in homes here in the United States. Other places have set up dorms and places for those that are infected to be quarantined from other populations that they could spread it to, right? So they've had quarantine spaces. They've invested in tracing methods to know who they've been around, so they could watch and test those people regularly to see if they have been infected by the virus. And then again, massive testing in general at a lot of different points. A lot of places have, quick testing capabilities nationally where you can get it within hours, within 24 hours. Places that Trump has called asshole countries, and I'm thinking particularly Africa, have this virus much more under control than we do because, again, they're taking a community approach of community members wearing masks, lots of testing and tracing, and quarantine facilities in places in Africa that a lot of folks like to look down on because of less money, blah, 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 down the line, and just racism. All right, let's name it as such. But they're not the only ones. Again, Europe, nations in Asia have these things much under control. Even if there's small spikes, they can get those spikes a lot easier under control. We're still in the first wave here, right? Economically, there's no real relief package out of that first one. Other nations have basically let the federal government take upon the weight of payroll and rent and covering 85% of people's pay, covering that, and, making sure that businesses are covered so they're not going out of business. And so these are all things on that one, lessen the impact on the economy. So people are still getting income. People aren't being evicted and businesses aren't shuttering. Unlike here, where the people that have benefited the most and have been able to sustain themselves are massive corporations that are already worth billions. Billionaires have made away with billions in this, yet the vast majority of our populace is poor, is more unemployed, making less money, struggling in a lot of different ways with a very minimal relief package for the majority of Americans, again, with corporations and billionaires walking away with billions, right, as most of us are struggling in some way, shape, or form. The shutdown was led by states, was not supported by Trump, has not been supported by Trump and the GOP at any level. The ending of it was being pressured by capital, by big business, and the GOP at every level, state, local, federal. And again, now we have 200,000 Americans dead. They deny any responsibility and continue to push us to work for capital. Trump has known the severity of it, has lied, continues to lie, say he didn't want to cause panic, which is rich from a guy who has continually tweeted out and broadcasting panic statements of Antifa and immigrant caravans of rogue thugs and blah, blah, blah. This guy continually pushes panic statements of things that just aren't true. Vast amounts of his supporters, are brainwashed and fall in line with these statements. It's so bad that some of these folks are believing that these fires are spread by Antifa out west. They're talking about the chaos in these blue cities, right? Where, there's been some looting. 95% of protests have been peaceful on the protest part. Let's put that out there. And the ones that have devolved largely due to police violence and police escalation, the looting and property destruction was very self-contained in small parts of the city, like Madison, parts of State Street, right? That is a very small section of the city. And it hasn't been like this widespread cities burning, mass chaos kind of thing that he likes to present it as. So again, there's somebody that broadcasts panic for everything else, but claimed he didn't want to broadcast panic for COVID. Come on now. So again, Trump knew and Trump lied and continues to lie. The GOP continually expects us to sacrifice ourselves for capital, for wealthy who are largely much safer than us and are making like bandits. The GOP at every level is fighting proactive measures and reactive measures that not only keep us healthy, but also economically safe. This is in Wisconsin, particularly with the current state Supreme Court ruling on forcing, on saying that the in-person school ban wasn't allowed here in Dane County, again, striking down really a health-focused preventative measure of spread, putting families and children and teachers, so many lives at risk. Thankfully, MMSD is not currently opening, and we see with UW-Madison, the opening has been an absolute disaster. They also have helped fund and ratchet up panic in their supporters to protest shutdowns. When if we took measures seriously, the shutdown really would have been short, or at least how we view the shutdown. And we would have been able to have a real safe quasi-reopening like we see in many other countries that we can't actually travel to because they have travel bans on us because of our infection and death rates, right? That do a ton of contact and tracing and testing. One where payrolls, again, and salaries are taken care of. People aren't evicted. Instead, this pandemic that is disproportionately impacting Black and brown folks and lower income folks in general are being forced to work and serve. And even a lot of middle class folks are being forced to work and serve in the name of capital, to sacrifice our lives in the name of capital, with fascist rhetoric suggesting that this is for the greater good. They can't feign ignorance. They know. They've known. None of these people are, maybe one or two of the real QAnon crazies out there that are elected, have dismissed the health impact sheet. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court doesn't even meet in person. They meet remotely. They know the health risks. They're protecting themselves from the health risks, but don't believe that you're worth protecting. The American people in general are facing a real genocide. 200,000 dead. 200,000 are dead. Most of those are more massively preventable. Most of those Black and brown, with a racist president whose some of his biggest supporters, like Peter Thiel, there's just been a report put out that he has engaged closely with self-declared Nazis and other white supremacists. A president who refuses to disavow those that carry out racist violence in his name. Who has spouted racist rhetoric and has encouraged white supremacist violence across the nation with a virus that is disproportionately killing Black and brown folks. GOP leaders that aren't ignorant of the health impacts, the economic impacts, continue to let this spread without taking any course of actions, locally, state, federal level, and encourage entities to stop any preventative or proactive measures. Again, this is genocide. This is absolute genocide. And it is imperative that we talk about it as such, right? This isn't just ignorance or being neglectful. This is intentional. They know. They've known. And they are acting out in such a way, in an intentional way, that are killing thousands and thousands of people. We are facing 500,000 dead by the end of this year. 500,000. It doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. We have to see these people and their behavior for what it is. It's genocide. Well, that is it for this week. Thank you for coming and listening. I'm Matthew Brown, and I'm your host for Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. Tune in every Wednesday here at Masson 365. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can find us, myself, or other Masson 365 podcasts at Stitcher, Apple Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Thank you, and see you next week.
This is 365 Media.